has started.
I am a professor of neurology. I've been at the University of Louisville since 2008. And for the past 11 months, I've been on sabbatical at the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine in Japan, doing research on Drosophila and the effect of various bacteria on neurodegenerative models. I'm pleased to talk to you now about medical and scientific publishing. I think this will be quite a fun talk because there are very interesting things about publishing, about journals, about reviews, and how to succeed in academic medicine. I will very much welcome your questions at the end. Please let me know what needs further explanation, or if you disagree with something I've said, or you'd like to ask questions about it. I'm pleased to recognize my collaborators at U of L, shown here, along with others in Japan and England, who are active in the publishing we've been doing. And I acknowledge support from particularly the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science and some corporations and other agencies, foundations, and individuals, and the university. I also acknowledge the support of the trees of the forest, because this is a talk about publishing, and we wouldn't have been able to have many journals if we didn't have paper. This is a very old tree here in Kyoto. It's a remarkable thing because the country is so mountainous. There are a lot of areas where the trees could not be cut down for farmland because it was too hilly. So there are remarkably old trees which unfortunately are absent in large parts of the United States. So the first question here when considering publishing is why? And I think the point is very poignant and very important, and that is when you educate one student, you've educated one student. And that's a wonderful thing to do. And of course, we all do that. That's part of our mission. And we know that if we influence one student, that can influence their competence for the rest of their life. And if you do this with 50 students by giving a talk, you may influence these 50 students for the rest of their lives and make them better doctors and take better care of people for the next 50 years. However, when you publish, you can influence thousands of people all over the world, now and even into the future. So 20, 30 years ago, we used to get reprint requests. So I would publish a paper, and then I'd get a postcard from Turkey saying, would I please send a copy of my paper to this person in Turkey? And it was very moving to get these postcards because there was not an internet, and you couldn't get the papers online, and this person's library in Turkey may not have had a subscription to that journal. So I was always very fastidious in responding and sending papers to anybody who ever asked for it. But it just showed or illustrated to me how publishing is an international thing. And also, papers I've written maybe 20 years ago, somehow, occasionally they're still cited, so people are still reading them. They're still part of the world scientific literature. So the influence of publications goes over all the world, and it lasts for a long time. Now, furthermore, publishing is very important for promotion in academic departments, in universities and hospital systems. I have a list here of the 5 things that are most important for this. And this is not true of every institution, but it is my experience. I worked previously at the National Institutes of Health, and then at Case Western Reserve University and U of L. And before NIH, I worked at the University of California, Berkeley, and Davis. And in most places, as much as they say they care about clinical care and teaching, They don't care about that as much as they care about money. So the most important thing in most departments and what determines how you would get advanced, and advancement means a higher salary and also perhaps better opportunities. What really counts is getting grants and funding. And publications are also very important, probably less important than funding. Clinical care, unfortunately, in my experience, often doesn't count that much. So if you're a really wonderful doctor, that's really good. If you're not wonderful but very competent, that may not make that much difference. It's kind of hard to know who is a really good doctor and who isn't. Teaching should be more important, but often it doesn't count for that much. And of course, there's administration, which is something everybody has to do and is often not properly recognized. But publication is definitely part of this process. And unfortunately, it often ends up counting how many papers you've published. We often say that if you don't publish in academic medicine, that you're finished, or publish or perish. And that whether that applies to U of L, I really don't know, because these things change with different administrations and different situations regarding economics of the medical school. In many universities, if you are appointed as an assistant professor, you have 6 or 7 years to be promoted, and that will depend on your publication record and funding. And if you don't publish enough and you don't have a good review, you will have to leave. However, this business about publish or perish is not accurate because of the illustration of Joel Hildebrand, who was a professor of chemistry at Berkeley, who died at the age of 102. And his last paper was published when he was 101. And if you look at the graph in the middle, these are his publications from 1922 to up here till 1982. His last paper was published when he was 101. So he published, and he still perished, showing that the publish or perish business is not accurate. And in case anybody's wondering about what I mean, this is supposed to be funny. But it is generally true that if you don't publish in many institutions, you will have to leave. So how do you write a paper? The best word might be simplify. Don't make it more complicated, and make it as understandable as possible. Use smaller words than bigger words, and shorter sentences than big sentences. This is very difficult. And don't assume that the reader or the reviewer is as interested as you are. Often, authors will get into the weeds, so to speak, and before you know it, they have a sentence which contains like 5 different acronyms. And the MI showed that the ACRD was inhibiting the PC247, and it gets very complicated, and it turns off the reviewer. It's good to have an important message, but maybe not too many. Don't apologize. Don't say that you're not this, so you didn't do that because you're not a chemist or something like that. Then the top journals want mechanisms. They don't want to know about something that happened, or you did this and you found that. They want to know why. And they want to know in a molecular way. Sometimes this is not possible. But if at all possible, even in a case report, they would like mechanisms. Then it's important to say that you don't need to have a perfectly finished message. That's often not possible in science. Maybe it's always not possible in science. There's always more research to be done. And as a reviewer, I don't like the sentence that the paper ends with the words, Further research needs to explore this and this and this. Of course, it's always true that further research is needed to explore something. But you shouldn't think, oh, I can't publish this because I didn't answer this question, I didn't answer that question. A good paper should address lots of questions which need to be addressed in other papers. An interesting point is illustrated by this paper I wrote with Melvin Yarr. Melvin Yarr was a president of the American Neurological Association and the leading neurologist of the 70s and 80s. And he told me, I was a resident, he said, hey, Friedland, I got this girl with chorea, and she has mono. And nobody ever wrote there's never been a paper on mononucleosis with chorea. Chorea being an abnormal movement, like Huntington's chorea, but this was not Huntington's, caused by an infection in the brain with mononucleosis. And he told me about the patient, and I went to see her, and I said, okay, I'll write this paper for him. And I was very junior, and I didn't know better, so I read basically every paper ever written on mononucleosis in the brain in the past 100 years. In all different languages, I had them translated, and it took me 9 months. And I found a paper in French of a person who had chorea from mononucleosis. And I wrote the paper, and I gave it to Yarr, and what do you think his response was? I thought, oh, he'd be really happy because I did such an incredible job. Well, it turned out he was very upset because I showed that he was wrong, that there wasn't a paper previously published about this. But the point, and it was published in Archives of Neurology, although he held it on his desk for an entire year because he was so upset with me. The point is that you don't have to read everything. I thought if I'm going to write a paper, I need to know everything, ever, and completely. And that's wrong. You don't have to know everything. And actually, it's impossible. So nowadays, if you're studying COVID-19 and you want to read about COVID-19, I don't know the present number, but there may be 10,000 papers on COVID-19 now. You can't possibly read 10,000 papers. So it is an important point that you can write a good paper and do very good research without knowing everything, without reading everything. You should read a lot, but you have to be judicious about how you spend your time. A manuscript generally should have an abstract introduction, methods, and discussion. This order can vary, so in Science and Nature, there's a very different system, which is not like that. Some journals want the methods after the discussion. So you're basically saying why, how, and so what. What does it matter what you found? Important thing is that don't put the methods in the introduction. Don't put the methods in the discussion. Don't put the discussion in the methods. This can also be very complicated sometimes. Now, I'm asking this question to everybody. How is an abstract different from a bicycle? And the answer is that the abstract should stand on its own, and a bicycle cannot stand on its own. Bicycle cannot stand on its own because it is too tired. So the idea of the abstract standing on its own, a lot of people will not read the paper, but they'll read the abstract. So you don't want to write an abstract which doesn't say anything about your paper. You want to imagine that the reader is not reading the paper, or that many people will read only the title, and many people will read only the abstract. So summarize in the abstract, but don't end up saying, "Oh, I will discuss the influence of so and so on so and so in in this paper." Don't say what you're going to do. Just explain what you did, summarize it, and it should stand by itself. And most readers will not read the paper. Hopefully the abstract is so interesting and exciting that they will all read the paper, but that won't happen. Don't put the methods in the discussion, and etc. So it's interesting to consider this particular journal. It's called Scientific Reports. It's published by Nature, and it welcomes negative studies. The reviewers are told repeatedly, the work does not have to be significant. It just has to be competent and sound. So if you do some study and you don't find the exciting results you wanted, you shouldn't bury it, because it can be a contribution even if it's negative. It may save somebody the time of doing it by themselves. It can turn out to be very important. So in my opinion, you have an obligation to publish everything you do if it's of interest. It doesn't have to be of enormous interest. And it can be valuable even if it's not earth-shattering. Also, there are many journals now, so that even if it's not earth-shattering and maybe not as highly skilled in its completion as a paper in Scientific Reports, you can get it published in other journals, which can still earn work for the reasons you want to publish to help your career. You should consider the impact factor. The higher the impact factor, the more difficult it is to get published. But impact factor is not the only thing to consider. Your discipline is important. So if you're in nursing, I've been told that in academic settings, nurses have to publish in nursing journals, not in medical journals. I'm not sure if that's as true everywhere. Or if you're in dental school, you might do better publishing in dental journals, not in medical journals. And if you look at the list of editors or associated editors of journals, it can help to see if you know somebody. It can help you get the better review or get the better decision based on the review. An example here is this paper, which was the first description of the amino acid sequence of the amyloid protein in deposits in the brain in Alzheimer's disease in 1984 by Glenner and Wang. It has now over 1,000 citations, which is a lot. And the impact factor of this journal is now only 3. And I believe in 1984 it was much lower. So it's perfectly okay to publish in a low impact journal. The goal of publishing, as I said, is to enhance science, and you can do that without publishing in Nature or Nature Medicine. Although it may help further if in academic promotion or getting grants if you publish in the high impact journals. I suggest that this paper was published in this journal because they wanted to get it out as soon as possible. They didn't want to have the editor send the paper out for review to 3 of the competitors of Glenner and Wang and have them bury it with their reviews. But I don't know if that was the case. When you look at your data and consider publishing, it's important to look at all of it. Don't just look at the summary statistics. So this is a paper we wrote in 1985. We showed there are lateral hemispheric asymmetries in cortical metabolism in Alzheimer's disease that are linked to behavior. So people who had more loss of metabolism on the left had more trouble with language. People have more loss of metabolism on the right, had more difficulty with root finding. This was not known at the time, and of course, it's obvious in retrospect. However, when we did it, if you look at the graph on the bottom, my initial observation was the mean. These are Alzheimer, and these are controls. Alzheimer and controls. This is metabolism in the frontal lobe, temporal parietal lobe, and entire cortex. And this is more metabolism on the right over here and more metabolism on the left. So the average is exactly the same in both groups. And it took several months before one of my collaborators pointed out to me what it should be obvious. It wasn't obvious to me, but it should be obvious, should have been obvious, that the variability was much greater in the case group, because there were some people in the case group who had much more metabolism on the right or more metabolism on the left, both, especially in the temporal parietal cortex. So this is just an example of, it's valuable to look at all the data. If you just looked at the means, you wouldn't I didn't notice that for a while because I didn't look at all the data. It's good to put as much data as you can in the paper. And if the editor thinks it's too much, he or she can always say there's too much of this and too much of that, and then you change it. Better that than for them to tell you that the data was incomplete. It's very wise to put the result in the title. So this is a paper of ours from 2016. This kind of strep mutans expressing this protein is a risk factor for microbleeds. The paper on the bottom, analysis of 6 pre-thyroid insecticide metabolites, does not have a conclusion. And the point is, many people will not read the paper, and they won't read the abstract, they'll only read the title. And since the whole point of publishing, or one of the points, is educating people, you want them to know what you found. So the easiest way to do that is to put it into the title. And so there will be people who get the journal table of contents in the mail, or I mean in email, and they'll just read the title of all the papers, and then they'll decide what to do. So if you understand that people might only read the title, that's a good reason to understand why you should put the result in there, if it's possible. Sometimes it's not possible. You should include as much data as you can. Now, oh, that was repetitive. I had that slide before. And the point of that was to get me to say, don't make the paper repetitive. So if you say something in the introduction, don't say it again in the discussion. If it's really important, maybe wait till the discussion to point it out. And it's just irritating to be a reviewer and having them and have the paper be repetitive. And have the paper be repetitive. That's repetitive. Right? Avoid gibberish. And you may be used to all the acronyms, but the other people may not know if MI is myocardial infarction or mitral insufficiency. And it really irritates me if I read a paper and they have a acronym and they don't define what it means. Probably the authors are so certain that everybody knows this, but well, okay, I'm not one of everybody who knows this, and I don't know what the paper, I can't understand the paper if I don't know what these acronyms mean. So you might have to have them, but be sure that they're defined. And don't have too many special words or expressions, which is jargon, that is difficult for others. So I have the sentence below, which I'm not going to read, but this is the kind of sentence which is very hard to understand for anybody. if you want to say such complicated things, probably it's better to have two sentences. I think that there is not a sufficient respect for letters. Letters can make a significant contribution to science. And I think neurology allows for letters. I don't know about Annals of Neurology. The Lancet still has letters. Science still and Nature both have letters. They can be very hard to be published. And I recently objected strongly to something in the New England Journal, and I wanted to write a letter, and I found out that you had to respond within 4 weeks. If you were 1 day over 4 weeks, they would not consider it. So in general, if you write a letter, you have to be very quick. And you don't know what can happen from a letter. So in 1979, I was very junior and had I just finished my fellowship, and I hadn't written maybe 1 or 2 papers. And I wrote a letter to the Lancet because they made a mistake. It was about normal pressure hydrocephalus and the CAT scan. They just had said something which was wrong, and it was like a typographical error, but they published my letter. So for some reason, the editor of the American Heart Journal called me and asked if I would write an editorial about this topic of hematocrit and blood flow. Why he thought that, I have no idea. It was kind of ridiculous. So because of that letter, I ended up writing an editorial in the American Heart Journal. And I used a friend of mine, I did it with a friend of mine who was a hematologist. So that is an important aspect of publication I haven't mentioned. You can always have other people help you, and their names can be on the journal, and everybody's needs, or everybody's desires are fulfilled. And it's quite a wonderful thing to have collaboration in publication. The letter Hadlow wrote in Lancet in 1959 was critical because he pointed out for the first time that Kuru was similar to Scrapie, which suggested to Daniel Carlton Gajusek, who was studying these things, that maybe Kuru in New Guinea was an infectious disease. This may be the key to this great discovery, which won the Nobel Prize for Gajusek. Although Gajusek denied that this letter was important, but it seems to me that it was. But I only mention it as an example that letters can be quite interesting and valuable. Another example here is this letter I published in the New England Journal, which is my only New England Journal publication. And probably the paper the published thing I've done which got the most press because it had a catchy title of Video Game Palsy. And it illustrates the interest, the value of publishing letters, but also the value of talking to patients. Because the patient had this weakness and numbness in his hand, and he didn't know why, and I didn't know why either. And we did an EMG and all sorts of things, and couldn't find out why. He was maybe 30 years old. And the last thing I asked him was, why did he think he had it? And he said, oh, maybe it's because I'm playing this video game all the time, rubbing my thumb into this little ball on the machine, and maybe that's it. And that was what was responsible. Also, if you have an observation in it with a patient or a research project, you may think, oh, this isn't very interesting because it's obvious. Well, almost everything in retrospect is obvious. It's obvious that bacteria can live in the stomach and cause peptic ulcers, but it wasn't obvious in 1985. And Horace Wells in the Boston area noticed that nitrous oxide was a very good anesthetic and it helped in dental procedures. However, the story is that he thought it was so obvious and other people were using it, he wouldn't publish it. So he was rather, like 15 years later, did he first publish it. So whatever you observe in your practice or in research, things that may appear to be obvious may still be very interesting and interesting to others. Examples of things which are obvious in retrospect, of course, these three great discoveries is Copernicus and the circulation of the Earth around the sun, Semmelweis, that physicians should wash their hands after they deliver a baby or after they go to the morgue, and Pasteur, who developed the germ theory. All of these things were treated with disdain and refusal at the time, but in retrospect, they're obvious. So this is Alexander Fleming, Stanley Prusner, and Edward Jenner. So Fleming is credited with discovering penicillin. Prusner won the Nobel Prize in '96 for the prion concept, which is an infectious protein configuration without DNA. And Edward Jenner, of course, is responsible for the smallpox vaccination. They were all not the first. So Fleming didn't discover the first antimicrobial product from fungi. Prusner didn't originate the hypothesis that this agent does not have DNA. And Jenner got the idea of the vaccine from the nursemaids who were milking cows, who noticed that the girls or women who had cowpox ulcers didn't get smallpox. So this is not to diminish the contribution of these three great scientists. Just to point out that if you're interested in something and somebody's already found it, that doesn't mean that you can't make a contribution. It's very good to be the first, but it's not necessary. This process is an important aspect of publishing, that you should be prepared for unforeseen events, so that if you're doing a research study and all your data is in the computer and the computer crashes and you can't get it out, that's a problem. Or if there's a power failure and your freezer is broken, and this happens on say a 4-day weekend, and your frozen samples are ruined, or somebody loses the lab notebook, or the building burns down. So it's a rather unpleasant subject, but everybody who does research or does publication should consider what disaster could happen which would interfere with your project. And it doesn't matter how unlikely these things are. Horrible things like this they just happen to happen. So that it's important that freezers must have a backup system, and the backup systems need to be tested. It's worth reviewing grants and reviewing papers whenever you have an opportunity. You may think, well, reviewing papers for some journal is a waste of time because you're not paid. Or being on a grant review committee is a waste of time because you're not paid and it's a lot of work. But it's a very educational activity. It teaches you a lot about publication and about writing grants. And that is why whenever I can and I get invitations for paper reviews, I will suggest members of the department who could be a reviewer. Don't write too many review articles unless you're introducing a new concept. Review articles don't count for much in academic calculations. Of course, it is possible that you write a review article like Prusner wrote a review in 1984 about the word prion, which is very important. But aside from some important new concept, just discussing treatment options for occipital neuralgia, let's say. That might be interesting paper, it might be valuable, but it's not the kind of thing which would help you get a grant or help you be promoted. And just as an aside, I was thinking myself of writing a review. I thought of writing a review on this topic of a comprehensive treatise on the marine amphibia. And here's a picture of a frog on a raft. And I don't know if anybody who's attending would have an opinion about the value of this work. But I thought it would be rather interesting because I could tell you the first sentence, which is the last sentence, which is there are no marine amphibia. So there are no frogs that live in the sea. Okay, Kathy smiled. That's the first sign of human contact I've had now for half an hour. Now, case studies are valuable. They're generally not enough, but I don't mean to imply that they're not important. So case studies are very important, but if you write only one case here, two cases there, and one case there, that is generally not enough to get a promotion from assistant to associate professor, but it may be helpful and it may be valuable. A lot of people in medicine think case studies are passé and they're not worthwhile, and I think that's wrong. So I illustrate three examples here, particularly Langston, who discovered MPTP, which is a Parkinson toxin. He discovered that from cases he had. And it's a long story, but there's a wonderful book, Frozen Addicts, which is about this problem. But he did this on his own and it was a very important discovery. Jimmy Parkinson, who wrote the Shaking Palsy in 1817, this is just a description of cases. He didn't have any autopsies. He didn't do any deep brain stimulation, of course. Robert Schwab was the first to suggest amantadine was a treatment for Parkinson's disease. And this is a particularly important, or actually maybe a particularly interesting story because I had a patient in probably in the Bronx in the 70s who had Parkinson's, and she told me one day, you know, Dr. Friedland, I was responsible for the discovery of amantadine. And I said, well, how is that? And she said, well, I was seeing Dr. Schwab, and I had the flu, and somebody gave me amantadine for the flu, and my Parkinson's got better. So I told him, and he didn't believe me. So I went on it again and came back to see him and showed him, aren't I better now, Dr. Schwab? And he said, I don't believe you. So he went off it and went back to him, and she went on and on it and off it and on and off it and went to see Schwab and convinced him, and then eventually he did a trial and showed it was effective. But my point is, this is three examples, and of course there are countless others, that it can be worthwhile publishing a case report or a series. After you publish, you must keep the records, and I don't know how many years. It used to be 10 years, but it depends on who funded your work. So if you publish, if you have an NIH grant, somebody may want to see your data 8 years later, and you have to be able to show it. Or if you publish anything 5 years later, somebody may say, oh, how come the MRI scan of this patient doesn't look right? Is this really the MRI of that patient? And I mean, of course, this is something we all hope this never happens, but you can't respond by saying, oh, I threw it out. So a normal response to having published something is then you throw everything out. You just would throw it out to clean out your office. but you can't do that. You have to keep it, and exactly how many years depends on who funded the work and maybe where it was published. Then when you publish, if the paper is rejected, what you can do is make all the changes they suggest and then submit it to a better journal because it's now a better paper. And you don't even need to thank the reviewers. So I got a paper rejected by Neurology when Bud Rowland was the editor, and this was before the internet, he wrote his comments in red ink on my manuscript. And practically every line had some red ink correction by this editor. And I wanted to thank him, but it's not possible, right? I got published somewhere else. And a main point I want to make is rejection does not necessarily mean your paper is not worthwhile. You need to have an acknowledgement section. And you don't need to thank the trees. That's not really necessary, especially now that most of our papers are not printed. But you need to thank your funders. And it's very fun to point out that in Gajdussek's 1966 paper in Nature, showing the transmissibility of Kuru, he thanked the 3 chimpanzees, Daisy, Joanne, and Georgette, in writing. Oh, that's not. So another main point of mine is the whole thing is not a scientific process. It's peer review. It's a very poor sample. It would be equivalent to say, okay, the election results are now in, and Vermont has three people voted from Vermont, and 2 of them went for Clinton, and 1 of them went for Trump. So it would be ridiculous if there were only 3 people from each state voting. But when you get a scientific review, it's only 2 or 3. It could be 3 people who like it or 3 people who don't. It may not necessarily imply that your paper is no good. But there is no other method, so it's the best method possible. But it's not scientifically valid. So you should, the point is that if it is rejected, the worst response is to say, oh, damn it, just keep it and sit on it and never get it published. Avoid excessive tables. It can be, I prefer graphs are better than tables. Avoid excessive precision. So this I find very irritating for some reason. But if you got 58 subjects in Group A and 78 in Group B, don't tell me that 45.6% of them were men, because it's completely meaningless if you didn't even have 100 subjects. So if you just said 46% were men, that would be fine. To say they're 45.6% means you don't understand what statistics are. Similarly, if you report the BMI as 32.32, it just is pointless. 32.3 would be enough. I'm coming to a conclusion, and you must include your strengths and weaknesses. So this is in the discussion. You have a paragraph about what's good about your paper, and then you have a paragraph about what's not good. And you should be harsh, because if you say something about your paper that means you recognize it has a shortcoming, it takes away the energy of the reviewers saying, oh, this paper is not good because of so-and-so. If you don't mention it, then it implies that you didn't even know that this was a weakness of your paper. So it's good to have a really nice paragraph there about how you should have had more subjects, or you should have done this, you should have done this, and you might explain why you didn't do it, but at least it shows you're aware of that. Journals sometimes ask who you want to be a reviewer, and you can list your friends. One journal said, who do I want to be not a reviewer? And for both they asked for the email addresses, and I gave them the email addresses of the people I wanted to review. I didn't fill in the email addresses of the people I did not want to review because I did not want them to be contacted. But they said they would not accept the paper. They would not allow the submission of the paper if I didn't give the email addresses, if I didn't give them the email addresses of the people who I didn't want to be contacted. So it's kind of ridiculous for me to tell them somebody I don't want to review it and then tell them how to contact that person. So I don't know if they go ahead and probably they ask some of the people you don't want. So it may be wiser not to put anybody in that category. So I am on the associate editorial board for this journal. It's interesting how it works. So they ask me if I want to be an editor for this journal paper. So they'll send me the title and the abstract. And if I accept, that means I get to pick the reviewers. And it gets very complicated because I may have to pick literally 10 reviewers who will be invited to review the paper. And then I might get only 2 or 3 people who agree to review the paper. Then these 2 or 3 people review the paper and I review their reviews, or I assess their reviews and I make a decision. It's very important that you must cite people who might be a reviewer. If your paper is reviewed by somebody who is not cited in your paper, who should have been cited, that is not a good idea. And the reviews are not scientific. I mean, ideally they are, but it may not be that way. Don't assume that a negative review is correct. It might mean that the paper is no good. It might mean the reviewer wants to take your ideas and reject your paper so he or she can proceed with their paper. It may mean that the reviewer is an alcoholic. It may mean your work was so good that this reviewer was too dumb to understand what you were doing. Or it could be the reviewer doesn't want you competing in his field. So all of these, I'm sorry to be so negative, but this is possible. I'm not saying it happens all the time. It doesn't happen all the time. And I will conclude with this rather wonderful story. Rosalind Yallo won the Nobel Prize for radio immunoassay in 1977. And in her Nobel lecture, which was published by the Nobel Committee, figure 2 in her Nobel lecture is this letter of rejection from the Journal of Clinical Investigation. The second major criticism relates to the dogmatic conclusion: the data do not support your work, according to Stanley Bradley, who's now famous for having rejected the Nobel Prize-winning work of Rosalind Yallo. So a rejection doesn't mean that you weren't right. So it's very critical to not let it put you down. Rosalind Yallo also said, if you ever have a new idea and it's really, really new, you have to expect that it won't be widely accepted. I recommend not publishing in books because people don't read books nowadays. Publishing a chapter in a book might be very nice, but it might not be widely read. In conclusion, when publishing, it is important to take off your shoes and wear clean socks. Does anybody know why this is true? When you're publishing, you should take off your shoes and wear clean socks because you will be standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is kind of a wonderful thing about publishing. You're contributing to the knowledge which began, with Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, and all of these people. It's a human endeavor going back 2,000 years. You're contributing to it. People will be reading your papers and contributing and building on it for hundreds of years to come. And it's rather an honor to be able to participate in such a wonderful process. And I will be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you for paying attention. And I don't know, is there someone to manage the questions, or people just please turn on your microphone and camera and ask.
Dr. Friedland, I don't have a question. I just want to tell you how thankful I am to hear these different little tips, pearls, wisdom nuggets. I haven't published a lot, but if some of the things I learned from publishing came through trial and error or rejection and revision, and for you summarizing these, I think it will really help individuals who are just starting on their publishing journey to know some of the little things that make a big difference.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you. I did. I remember when I was starting, and I thought I had to know everything. That was very intimidating. I figured. I also thought that in order to do this, you needed to be brilliant. And I thought, well, I'm not brilliant. I can't do calculus. I can't learn French. I'm not brilliant. Why would? But somebody asked me to write the paper about something, so I said, okay, I guess I could try to do that. So I should read everything ever written. And that's not necessary. And it's not necessary, also not necessary to be brilliant. The most important thing is hard work. Or as Louis Pasteur said, his most important feature was his tenacity. And it helps to have a collaborator like Peter Hedera, who is on the list, who I had two brothers who both had Binswanger's disease, and I didn't know what to do with them. And they both died, and I had autopsies. We had done autopsies, and then Peter came to work with me from Bratislava. And he came in my office, and I gave him this box. I said, here, Peter, can you figure out what's happening with these two cases? And he wrote a rather wonderful paper, which is one of the first papers on pedestal. Remember that, Peter?
Of course I do, yeah. It's a long, kind of, I don't want to think about when was that, but I do, yeah.
I think it was 1837, yes. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. And
thank you, Dr. Friedland.
I think if there are other, I didn't see anything in the chat function. I look forward to see everybody. I'll be back in a few weeks.
Yay. We look forward to seeing you, Dr. Friedland.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Friedland. Get home quick.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You as well.